So we're going to kick off the economics segment with a keynote by Dr. Evan Kwerel. Evan is Senior Economics Advisor in the Office of Economics and Analytics at the FCC. He was a recipient for the Paul A. Volcker Career Service Award for pioneering the use of competitive spectrum auctions to allocate the public airwaves for sound, data, video transmissions, helping fuel the digital revolution while adding more than $200 billion in government coffers. So I love this story. It really demonstrates leadership, vision, tenacity, really required to overcome skeptics and a lot of obstacles that we have, as government civilians really face. So the story is really inspiring. So if we could bring Evan online. How you doing, Evan?
I'm doing fine.
Well, welcome to the main stage. So I gave a quick introduction. I really appreciate you being here with us today, Evan. I'm very proud and honored to have you here, and you can take it away and provide your keynote. We'll be providing some questions to you in the end, okay?
Okay.
Thanks, Evan.
Okay. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. I'm honored to speak to you today, and I want to thank Mike Cotton and Rebecca Dortch for inviting me. Mike and Rebecca asked me to speak about lessons for making meaningful policy change based on my experience as a champion of innovation at the FCC. I want to start my talk with a lesson about the importance of implementation. Lesson 1, implementation. It's not enough to have a good idea. You also need to find a way to implement it. This lesson is one of the reasons I left academia for government. In government, you have far greater leverage to implement a good policy idea. Now I'm going to provide a personal history of an important innovation in spectrum policy, the introduction of spectrum auctions, pointing out additional lessons as I go along. I originally had 10 lessons, but now due to inflation, you'll have to suffer through 11. The idea of auctioning spectrum licenses was first proposed in 1951 by a law student, Leo Herzl, in an article in the University of Chicago Law Review. He proposed auctioning TV licenses to resolve the debate over colored television standards. The idea got far more prominence when the Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase expanded on it in his 1959 paper, The Federal Communications Commission, published in the Journal of Law and Economics. That paper proposed a comprehensive use of markets to manage spectrum rights, of which auctions were just one piece. Coase's broad vision has guided much of my work at the FCC. This brings me to lesson 2. Lesson 2, good ideas. Good ideas don't have to be original, but you do have to recognize a good idea when you see it and be able to adapt it to the specific circumstances where you hope to implement it. The idea of spectrum auctions didn't originate with me. Nevertheless, I made a difference by contributing to the adoption of spectrum auctions and the use of innovative auction designs. What makes a good policy idea? You should consider both the importance of the idea and the likelihood of implementation. If you care about making a meaningful difference, you should choose ideas with high expected values of pursuing. That is, try to maximize the increase in social value from implementing your idea times the increase in probability of implementation from your working on it. Now I turn to a brief history of spectrum license assignment. To understand why auctions are a good idea, one needs to know the alternatives. So I will now discuss the 3 methods that were used to assign commercial spectrum licenses before auctions. From 1912 to 1927, a first come, first served method called priority in use was used. With the passage of the Radio Act of 1927, the Federal Radio Commission used comparative hearings to award licenses when there was more than one applicant for a license. After the passage of the Communications Act of 1934, the Federal Communications Commission used the same method. Under this method, which the British colorfully call beauty contests, the FCC established criteria for choosing the best party to hold the license. Applications were assigned points based on how well they met the criteria. Hearings and court challenges could take years and were costly for both participants and government. It was often difficult to distinguish among applicants, and winners were frequently chosen based on trivial differences. Some people have also asserted that it was a highly political process used by politicians to extract favors, such as favorable television coverage from parties seeking licenses. But based on talking to people who administered it, I don't think it was. In 1982, Congress granted the FCC lottery authority to select among qualified applicants. Lotteries were not used until 1984, after cellular licenses in the 30 most valuable license markets had already been awarded. Lotteries turned out not to be a panacea for several reasons. First, lotteries caused socially wasteful expenditures by applicants seeking to obtain valuable licenses for free. The FCC received more than 400,000 lottery applications for the least valuable cellular licenses. Hazlett and Michaels estimated that between 500 million and 1 billion was dissipated in such rent seeking. Second, lotteries did not award licenses to the parties who valued them the most. Resale reassigned licenses to parties who valued them more highly, but assignments were still not as efficient as in a well-designed auction. Third, lotteries created windfalls, often for parties with no interest in providing cellular services. Frequently cited example was a group of dentists who won a cellular license for Cape Cod and sold it as soon as possible. Finally, lotteries raised no revenue. Shortly after the FCC started using lotteries, I told the deputy chief of my office that I wanted to write a working paper on spectrum auctions. He told me not to waste my time because auctions will never happen. I ignored his advice and pitched my proposal to the chief of the office, Peter Pitch, who enthusiastically supported it. The working paper, Using Auctions to Select FCC Licensees, co-authored with Lex Volcker, was released in 1985. After that, Peter convinced Chairman Fowler to take up the cause. Fowler proposed that the FCC seek legislation to authorize spectrum auctions, and he was able to get a congressional hearing in 1986. It wasn't until 1993 that Congress granted auction authority to the FCC. The legislation required that the FCC use auctions to award licenses when there were competing applications. Auctions cannot be used for license renewals or for broadcasting or for non-commercial licenses. Congress required that the FCC begin the first auction within 1 year of the signing of the legislation, an incredibly short time to implement a new government program. So what were the factors in leading to the passage of auction authority? I think the most important factor leading to auction legislation was the development of cellular technology, which greatly increased the demand for spectrum and the value of spectrum licenses. The increased value of spectrum made auctions a significant potential source of new revenue. And new revenue was especially important to the White House and Congress at the time. In 1993, the new Clinton administration was under tremendous pressure to find new sources of revenue because the 1990 PAYGO, or Pay As You Go Act, required new expenditures to be financed by new revenues. The high demand for cellular licenses also made more visible the defects of lotteries. It pains me to admit that the arguments that economists like myself made about allocative efficiency and dealing with inefficient rent seeking were probably compelling for few, if any, members of Congress. The most compelling argument was that auctions would raise new revenues, and Congress wanted the money. The main source of opposition to auction legislation was stakeholders, like broadcasters, who didn't want to pay for using spectrum. Other licensees also saw auctions as a potential cost to them, but broadcasters had the most political power at that time. Broadcasters feared that auctions, even if not permitted for them, could lead to acceptance of the idea of paying for the use of spectrum by other means, such as high license fees. What lessons can be learned from this? Lesson 3, persistence. If you believe in your vision, be both persistent and patient. It took 9 years from the release of my 1985 auction working paper, co-authored with Lex Volcker, to the first FCC auction in 1994. It took 15 years to the conclusion of the broadcast incentive auction from the release of the 2002 paper on two-sided auctions that I co-authored with John Williams, and 25 years from the release of our 1992 working paper on voluntary reallocation of spectrum from TV broadcasting to mobile use. Lesson 4, patrons. To achieve significant policy changes, you need a patron. A patron has the trust of key decision makers and confidence in you and your ideas. Peter Pitch and Don Gipps were my early patrons at the FCC. Chairman Fowler had confidence in Peter Pitch, and Chairman Hunt had confidence in Don Gipps. Later, when I was trying to sell the idea of broadcast incentive auctions, Paul Dessau, then chief of OSP, was my patron with the ear of Chairman Janikowski. Without a patron, there is little chance that someone like me, without significant formal authority, can drive major policy changes. I never had the authority at the FCC to require anyone to do anything. The only authority I've ever had is moral authority. What do you need to acquire a patron? I can think of 3 things. You need good ideas, the ability to sell them, and access to the patron. I've already discussed good ideas in lesson 2, but the other 2 points each warrant a lesson. Lesson 5, selling. A good idea is of little value if you can't sell it, either to your patron or directly to a key decision maker. This requires good communication skills and an appreciation for the value of the time of your audience. Lesson 6, access. Without good access to your patron or key decision makers, you probably won't get far, no matter how good your ideas and your ability to sell them. Good physical location facilitates good access. In selling and implementing the concept of the broadcast incentive auction, it was helpful that my office was just a few steps away from the offices of Paul Dessau, Blair Levin, who was the head of the broadcast task force, and later Gary Epstein, who was the head of the broadcast incentive auction task force. There's another lesson closely related to lessons on selling your ideas. Lesson 7, timing. You need to opportunistically seize the right moment to sell your proposals. After proposing a two-sided auction in my 2002 working paper, I tried to sell the concept as a solution to specific problems. I got close twice, including one time gaining the support of Chairman Powell. But in the end, the efforts always failed because of the lack of clear legal authority. When the Broadband Task Force was created in 2009, I saw another opportunity. I devised a way to use a two-sided auction to reallocate spectrum from TV broadcasting to mobile use. I sold my patron, Paul Dessau, on my proposal, and he sold Chairman Janikowski. The 2010 National Broadband Plan included my proposal and sought legislation, which was enacted in 2012. Now let me talk about my role in implementing the first FCC auction. When Congress gave the FCC auction authority in 1993, I was far from an expert in auctions, but I knew more about spectrum auctions than anyone else at the FCC. So I was tasked with developing a proposal for the design of the FCC's first auction. This is another illustration of lessons 2 and 3, getting ahead of the curve and identifying good policy ideas, and persistence in following that vision. In our 1985 auction working paper, Lex Volcker and I said that ideally, spectrum licenses should be auctioned simultaneously because of the interdependence of license values. That is, the value of a group of licenses is often worth more than the sum of the values of the individual licenses in the group. And bidders also want to be able to switch to other licenses when the price of a license gets bid up too high. But in 1993, when I wrote the auction design section of the auction notice of proposed rulemaking, I didn't know how to design a simple simultaneous auction. So I proposed a sequential auction. It never occurred to me that it was feasible to auction licenses simultaneously. At the time, it seemed that doing so would require a combinatorial auction in which winning bids were determined using a complex integer programming algorithm. But then Preston McAfee, consulting for AirTouch, and Paul Milgrom and Robert Wilson, consulting for Pactel, proposed similar novel simultaneous auction designs. The format went a long way towards achieving the benefits of simultaneity without the complexity of a combinatorial auction. The mechanics of their proposals were relatively simple because the auctions were a series of rounds in which individual licenses were up for bid at the same time. Both proposals were brilliant, but I thought that Milgrom and Wilson's proposal was the best. Only their design had the elegant feature of a simultaneous closing rule. The Milgrom-Wilson plan still needed some important details filled in, such as developing a mechanism to ensure that the auction would end in a timely manner. I worked with Milgrom to develop the activity rule, which provided bidders with an incentive not to hold back until late in the auction. Then I wondered, given a tight deadline, whether I should recommend something simpler for the first auction and propose the Milgrom-Wilson design for a subsequent auction. Thinking about the way bureaucracies work, I concluded that no, we should use their design right out of the block because of the precedent. It wasn't just getting the first auction right for its own sake. It was getting that first auction right because it was going to set the precedent for every auction after that for a very long time. So here are another 3 lessons. Lesson 8, flexibility. Be flexible on your means while staying true to your principles and goals. The design proposed by Milgrom and Wilson was clearly better than what I proposed in the NPRM, so I embraced it. Lesson 9, collaboration. When you're dealing with a big, complicated problem, such as designing and implementing the FCC auctions, you need a tremendous amount of collaboration. Making significant policy changes is a team sport. All my major accomplishments involve collaboration with numerous colleagues, agency leadership, academic and other consultants, and industry stakeholders. The scope of collaboration matters. It is not enough to get a policy right within the confines of your discipline, whether it be engineering, law, or economics. Successful innovation at the FCC has required extensive collaboration among lawyers, engineers, computer scientists, operations researchers, software developers, project managers, government contracting specialists, and economists. Who you collaborate with also matters. Having a few close collaborators who are creative and share your vision can make all the difference for policy innovation. My major achievements would not have been possible without the close collaboration of FCC electrical engineer John Williams and Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Milgrom. My last point also spotlights the value of collaboration with brilliant people outside of government. We need more of that if we want more innovation in government. Lesson 10, precedent. Once a program is implemented, if it's reasonably successful, it's very hard to change. So try to pick the right basic structure of initial implementation and then incrementally improve on it. Now for my last story and final lesson. To help decide which auction design to implement, Chairman Reed Hunt sent Don Gipps to ask staff 2 questions. First, he asked me, what is the best auction design? I said, I think Milgrom and Wilson's simultaneous multiple round auction design is absolutely the best, and explained why. Then he asked Karen Reggie, whom the FCC had hired to help implement the auction, can we implement it? And Karen said she was convinced that we could. Once Chairman Hunt committed to the Milgrom-Wilson design, he devoted the necessary resources to mitigate the risks and maximize the likelihood of success. Innovating in government requires that the agency leadership is willing to take risks. Implementing a novel auction design with complex features is not only hard to do, it is also very risky. When I first proposed we use a brilliant but never before used auction design, the head of my office said, I don't want us to be a beta test site. Fortunately, Reed Hunt was willing to take the risk. This leads me to my last lesson. Lesson 11, risk-taking. Innovation in government is too rare, in part because it takes taking risks. All involved, especially agency leadership, must be willing to take smart risks to try a new idea. FCC's decision in 1993 to move forward with an original auction design, and again in 2012 with the broadcast incentive auction, were giant risks. That ends my brief personal history of FCC auctions and some of the lessons I've learned. Thank you for listening. And now we go to questions. And could someone please put up the summary of my lessons for successful policy innovation? Okay, so now we move to new questions. So the first question is, do some bands of spectrum lend themselves to beauty contests? For example, air marshalling radars need wavelengths that work well at identifying planes, so that spectrum should be only used for radar use. I think the issue here has to do with allocation of spectrum and spectrum assignment. Allocation is the use of the spectrum, and assignment is who gets to use it. And until the broadcast incentive auction, which determined how much spectrum, the split in allocation between TV broadcasting and flexible use, including mobile services, until the broadcast incentive section, auctions were really used only for assignment and not for the allocation. And I think the question you're asking is, should we use auctions more generally for allocation, especially in complicated cases? And the answer is probably not. I mean, I think you might use it within a restricted range of allocations, such as the broadcast incentive auction, where you had two uses, broadcasting and mobile services, and there was an expectation of, we've already made a decision that we needed more mobile use, but there was a question of where you draw the line, and so it made sense to use auctions to draw that line. But it wasn't like we're going to use auctions to decide whether we're going to allocate something for radar or mobile use. So the answer is no. The next question here. Will auctions continue to draw billions of dollars of investment? Okay, well, I've made it a practice not to speculate on the number of dollars raised in auctions. Even though I'm an economist, my focus has generally not been on how much money auctions raise. But let me just say this. I mean, in order to raise billions of dollars in auctions, you have to be auctioning a significant amount of spectrum. And I'll give the Pi administration credit for emptying the auction, the spectrum cupboard. I mean, they did an enormous job of getting a lot of spectrum out there. So, there aren't that many auctions. There isn't that much spectrum that's in the cupboard. There's not much low-hanging fruit. And to mix a metaphor, there's not much low-hanging fruit in that cupboard. So I don't know that we're going to see a lot of dollars coming in the near future. But you didn't hear me say that because, as I said, I don't say things about how much money is coming in. Well, these are hard questions. Here's one, but it doesn't finish, and it looks like an interesting question. It says, how is the auction of shared spectrum affected the, and I don't see anything more. Oh, they didn't get any votes. So let me answer, we'll at least try to answer the question. Licensed spectrum rights holders have a financial incentive to use their holdings efficiently. Unlicensed spectrum users have the option of inducing FCC to give them more spectrum. How have these disparate incentives played in technology development over the last 20 years? It's really hard to say. Just on the first point, on the first point, it's not just that. It's not just the fact that licenses have been auctioned doesn't in itself provide incentive to use holdings efficiently. The fact it's really related to the fact that the spectrum is exclusively allocated as for exclusive use. So if we had beauty contests or lotteries assigning the spectrum, if it assigned it to the same winner, they would have the same incentive to use the spectrum efficiently, because neither the benefits of the costs or the costs accrue to other people. The problem with unlicensed spectrum is, something with the tragedy of the commons that people don't take into account the fact that their additional use reduces the amount of spectrum available to others. And how is it played in technology development? Well, I think, I don't really know, to be honest, but one issue is, I think that when you don't have to pay for it, there's rents. There's a certain amount of rent seeking to get unlicensed spectrum. So there's, can be a substantial incentive to lobby to expand the band instead of figuring out ways to use it more efficiently. But since it's hard to do, I don't know how that all balances out. So let me just say that I think we need both. I think there's a place for both licensed and unlicensed. And I'm out of time, so let me stop there. Anything else?
Now, Evan, thank you very much for your time. I know it can be a challenge to get all these diverse questions and challenging questions, but I really appreciate the inspiring words and the lessons learned on what it takes to plan and execute policy innovation. Really admire your work, and congratulations on the award.
Well, thank you very much.